Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow will help North Korea build satellites if Pyongyang asks. He made the comments while meeting the North Korean leader Kim Jong-Un in Russia's Far East. They're at the Vostochny Cosmodrome. Putin also said he and Kim would discuss a wide range of issues. The US suspects Kim Jong-Un is ready to supply weapons to Moscow for the war in Ukraine. In a moment, we'll speak to Yulia Shapovalova in Moscow, but first let's bring in Florence Looi, who's in Seoul. Florence, a face-to-face meeting and a long handshake, a significant meeting then for a number of reasons.
Absolutely. This is the second meeting between these two leaders, but it is Kim Jong-un's first trip abroad since the COVID pandemic. Now, these two leaders haven't been particularly close, but there appears to be an intention to project closeness. Now, Kim Jong-un has been reported as saying by North Korean state media that his visit to Russia really highlights North Korea's priority in putting ahead in building stronger ties with Russia. Now, North Korean state media has given this visit full coverage, and I think we can take from that there is a lot of importance placed on these ties between Russia and North Korea, and also perhaps a level of confidence that talks indeed between these two leaders are going to go well. Now, each side has what the other wants. Russia wants weapons, and North Korea wants hard currency, it wants food, it wants technology to help it advance its nuclear weapons program. Now, both sides are also ruled by authoritarian leaders, and they are both finding themselves increasingly isolated. Russia because of its war on Ukraine, and North Korea because of its nuclear weapons program, which is in contravention of UN Security Council resolutions and sanctions. So ahead of this, even before this meeting, there has been a clear intention to project an image of closeness. Russia really rolled out the red carpet for Kim Jong-un, having a minister meet him when he arrived at the border town on Tuesday morning. And now all these remarks that we're hearing from these two leaders, Kim saying, thanking Putin for taking time out of his busy schedule to meet him. Putin saying, I'm very glad to meet you. So really an intention to project closeness. And perhaps after this meeting, we might find that these two countries have agreed on even closer cooperation, militarily and perhaps economically as well.
And given what you say then, what has the international reaction been to the Kim-Putin meeting?
Well, the U.S. has warned about a possible arms deal taking place, and so we've heard U.S. officials renew their warnings and also threatening to impose new sanctions if such a deal were to go ahead. And regionally, well, countries like South Korea and also Japan have said they're watching developments very closely. They've also urged these two countries to not do anything to violate UN sanctions because they're both UN members. Now, we've also heard South Korean President urge China, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, to do more to rein in North Korea. South Korea also saying that it will deepen its ties with Japan and with the US to curb the rising threat from Pyongyang. But many analysts believe that China would be the key here in preventing an arms deal between Russia and North Korea from going ahead. Now, China so far has not issued many comments, apart from having its foreign ministry spokesperson say that, apart from having its foreign ministry spokesman say that this visit is a matter between these two countries. But some analysts in China are saying that what we're seeing here is just a reaction to what the US has been doing in the region for years in deepening its military cooperation, intensifying military exercises with partners in the region, and also in conducting more freedom of navigation operations. And make no mistake that North Korea and China and Russia have both criticized US dominance in this region.
Florence Looi, thank you for that. We're going to stay with this. Yulia Shapovalova joins us live now from Moscow. So, Yulia, what's the schedule for the two leaders now that they've met face-to-face and initial comments have been made?
Absolutely. Kim Jong-un's meeting with Vladimir Putin has already begun there at the Vostochny Cosmodrome in Russia's Far East. And obviously, we've heard from Vladimir Putin as saying that Russia is ready to help North Korea with its satellite program. Its own satellite program, its glorious satellite program, goes back to Soviet times, to last century. Right now, the Interfax agency writes that Putin and Kim will inspect several facilities there at the Cosmodrome and then will hold negotiations. It is expected that the North Korean leader will be shown how the Angara launch vehicle is being assembled there, and then the leaders will also inspect the launch complex of the Angara as well as the launch complex for the Soyuz 2 launch vehicle, which is still under construction there. And after that, they will hold negotiations. Well, Russia never actually revealed the topic of their talks, but we've heard earlier from the United States and from some analysts, they believe that Putin and Kim intended to discuss, first of all, the supply of ammunition from North Korea for the Russian army fighting in Ukraine. And in response, Kim allegedly wants to receive food aid and some military and space technologies, as well as some technologies for nuclear submarines from Russia. Well, just the day before, speaking at the Eastern Economic Forum, President Putin confirmed that he intended to visit the Cosmodrome, but did not tell the details of his program there, saying, when I get there, you will find out. By the way, the Vostochny Cosmodrome is a brand new spaceport of Russia. The construction of some of its parts is still underway, as I said, and Russia is trying to accumulate its latest and most advanced space and satellite technology there. It translates as the Eastern Cosmodrome, and it was intended to reduce Russia's dependence on other countries for its space exploration program. Since the mid-20th century, Russia's space agency had depended on the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan as its primary launch site.
And Yulia, overall then, what's the Russian perspective of Kim's visit? How is it being seen where you are?
Well, we're just getting reports of that meeting. Basically, I can't say that the expectations are high because basically all the points have been discussed before. Obviously, the whole world, as well as Russia, are closely watching the results of this meeting, and because we understand that it can affect the balance of power in the region and on the entire planet. Recently, Russia supported North Korea verbally, but now it wasn't. We hear some talks that Russia can withdraw from the UN sanctions imposed on North Korea before, because right now Russia is trading more and more with North Korea compared to previous times, because Russia was adhering to those UN sanctions. All that is happening because of Russia's isolation in the West, because the relations are becoming closer with North Korea now. Russia, of course, needs artillery shells from North Korea. While North Korea, being one of the most militarized countries in the world, can provide those ammunitions to Russia.
Yulia Shapovalova live for us in Moscow. Thank you. Well, let's bring in Robert Kelly now. He's Professor of Political Science at Busan National University. He joins us from Busan. Welcome to the programme. So in practical terms, when all the handshakes and smiles are done, what will both sides actually be hoping to get out of this?
Okay, so for the Russians, I think the big thing is getting the ammunition, the shells and the bullets, as your correspondent was just talking about. I think it's pretty clear at this point that the Russian defense industrial base cannot keep up with the needs of the Russian army out in the field in Ukraine. That war has gone on much longer than the Russians had anticipated. We know they're using tanks from like the 1960s. That tells us that the Russians are having real sort of shortages internally, and going to the North Koreans is sort of, I guess, a stopgap, if you will, right, until the Russians can sort of catch up themselves. I think the big issue on the Russian side then is sort of the failure rate, the quality of this this North Korean ammunition, right? Will these shells actually work? On the North Korean side, I think the upside is very large, which is that the Russians are desperate and the North Koreans can give this ammunition, and in exchange they can get stuff they really can't develop, the technologies, as been mentioned, for nuclear subpower or for satellites. So, and I think the benefits really fall best for the North Koreans.
Well, indeed. I mean, how big a boost is this for Kim Jong-un? Not just materially, but for his image on the world stage. We see him shaking hands with President Putin there.
Yeah, that's right. That's another good point, too, right? This is the same reason why Kim Jong-un went to meet Donald Trump back in 2018 and 19, even though that didn't really turn into anything meaningful, right? North Korea is pretty isolated, but it is in a direct kind of existential legitimacy contest with South Korea, which is to say the North Koreans want to prove that they are, in fact, a real Korean state and not some weird failed offshoot where South Korea is the real Korea. And so one of the ways the North Koreans do that is they want international recognition. So they ran off to meet Trump to get the pictures. You do the same thing with Vladimir Putin. You know, Russia's sort of a great power, right? It's got a permanent seat on the Security Council. So this sort of raises North Korea's profile, which is, as you might imagine, pretty low compared to South Korea, right? That's one of the reasons why Kim was willing to leave the country, which is pretty extraordinary.
And what will China make of this then, given that it has bilateral relations with both Russia and North Korea?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's sort of a wild card, right? And we know that the Chinese have allowed the North Koreans to park illicit money in Chinese banks for a while. The Chinese have looked the other way on sanctions busting. But the Chinese have also been sort of nervous that the North Koreans might overreach, right? The Chinese oppose Korean unification. They don't want a unified Korea on their border. But they also don't want an unhinged nuclear North Korea that sort of provokes the planet, you know, provokes the United States and sort of could stumble into a conflict, right? China would like North Korea to sort of just to exist but be calm. And the North Koreans are not like that, right? So I think the Chinese are kind of in a weird spot here. You know, they want the war in Ukraine to win, or to end soon. They want the Russians to win, right? They want to keep the North Korean nuclear program from spinning out of control and provoking a real American response. So I actually am not quite sure what the Chinese think. If I had to guess, I'd say they're probably actually opposed to this because they're worried that the North Koreans and the Russians are going to go off and make a deal that the Chinese wouldn't actually make with either of those partners themselves.
You touched on the US there. What will America be thinking about this, and South Korea?
Yeah, I think the American response is pretty obviously going to be negative, and the South Korean response under this president, South Korea has a conservative president, sort of a hawk on North Korea, and he said to the Russians publicly, right, that because Russia is a Security Council member and it has voted for the sanctions on North Korea, that, you know, Russia is not allowed to do this, which is correct, by the way. Security Council resolutions are technically international law, and the Russians aren't supposed to do this. I think, you know, Putin at this point is so desperate in Ukraine that he just doesn't care, right? And that's just going to alienate him even more from South Korean public opinion, right? And I think the Americans are very, very nervous that, you know, the Russians are going to give the North Koreans something really valuable like, you know, satellite technology, right? The North Koreans would like better satellites to guide their nuclear missiles, right? Including missiles that may be pointed at the United States. So I think the Americans are actually quite nervous about this.
Robert Kelly, we very much appreciate your time here on Al Jazeera. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Other news now, the death toll from the tsunami-like wave that destroyed the heart of a city in eastern Libya has risen to more than 5,200. Another 10,000 people are still missing after 2 dams collapsed in the port city of Derna. Many buildings have been destroyed and roads and bridges washed away. Alec Traina reports from the capital, Tripoli.
An unprecedented catastrophe. Entire communities in the eastern city of Derna have been swept away by floods or reduced to rubble. People here are still coming to terms with the aftermath of Storm Daniel.